James Gunn's Peacemaker is wrapping up its second season this week, and while I haven't yet seen the final episode, it felt like a good excuse to talk about what is quietly one of the best live-action superhero shows ever made. There are various reasons for this. The cast is incredibly charming, including a brave and bold central performance from John Cena. Gunn is both unashamed of the show's comic book roots, and also willing to make bold authorial choices that suit the story that he is telling. Shot on a modest budget and released on streaming, Peacemaker doesn't have to be sanded down to conform to generic four-quadrant appeal like so many higher-profile superhero films and shows. However, for all the show's goofiness and comedy, Peacemaker is so interesting because it is actually and meaningfully about things. Like Matt Reeves or Ryan Coogler, Gunn is one of the handful of writers and directors working in superhero film and television who can meaningfully be discussed as an auteur. He's a filmmaker with his own signature style, a set of key collaborators that he likes to work with, and a clear and distinctive perspective. Gunn has things to say, and a platform to say them. Peacemaker is a show about modern masculinity.
I've come to the conclusion you suffer from a particularly severe form of toxic masculinity.
What?
It's about the way that white supremacy takes root in contemporary America. It's about the superhero as a power fantasy, whether liberal or conservative. Hell, in the grand tradition of comic book legend Jack Kirby, Peacemaker is also a show about how much the author loves his big, beautiful wife. This season is all of those things, with something else on top. The second season of Peacemaker is a show about the internet and what it's doing to modern America. So we're going to talk about that this week. We're going to talk about what makes James Gunn so distinct as a filmmaker, how his personality shines through in the work that he does. We're going to talk about how both Superman and Peacemaker are stories about the modern world, in particular stories about how the internet has affected the way that we relate to one another. Then we're going to take a step back, and we're going to look at Gunn's relationship to the superhero genre and what makes him such an interesting creator in the specific context of superhero mass media. This will involve talking about the show with spoilers up to the 7th episode of the second season. We won't be discussing the finale because we haven't seen it yet. So Gunn could really screw us over if he wanted to. But if you want to go in completely blind, feel free to pause here and to peace out. Still got your tickets to the Gunn show? Great. Let's get dialed in. And I realize that's an internet joke that doesn't really work today, but just go with me on it. It is perhaps strange to talk about these gigantic crossover franchise projects as the work of strong authorial voices. After all, directors like Nia DaCosta have talked about how working on blockbuster superhero movies can feel impersonal, about having, quote, to go in with the knowledge that some of you is going to take a back seat. Part of what makes Gunn such an interesting filmmaker in this context, and so perfectly suited to this material, is that he manages to imbue his work with his own perspective and personality. This is perhaps most obvious with Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3, the movie that he made with Marvel after the company had fired him following a bad faith right-wing campaign relating to tweets that he had sent as a younger writer. And the entire film is very much about that experience. Now, to be clear, Gunn claims that most of the script was written before he was fired in July 2018. However, he did work on the script in the intervening years. In November 2020, he claimed that, quote, very little had changed with the script since he'd been rehired. But, as late as August 2021, he was still, quote, playing around with little things to make the script better. Still, setting aside the extent to which Gunn may or may not want to downplay the subtext that Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 is about how he was fired by the company that has also given him hundreds of millions of dollars to make this movie about that.
Wait, is this fucking play about us?
It's worth considering the film on its own merits. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 is highly focused on Rocket Raccoon, the character that Gunn has identified repeatedly as closest to him in his larger body of work.
And Rocket in particular, a lot of the story revolves around him, and that's the character I see as me more than any of the others.
And that was the journey of those three movies for me, was about Rocket, who's a character who I've felt closer to than any other character I've ever put on film, without a doubt.
When I worked at Marvel, I was really, I would get scripts with Rocket in them that didn't match how, I understood that character was my soul, you know?
In this film, Rocket is drafted by a gigantic and quite literally faceless corporation to help them create an alternate world, one populated by anthropomorphic animals that they consider to be their intellectual property, in much the same way that Gunn was drafted to help build out the world of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Also, it is worth noting that the High Evolutionaries' utopian paradise is a suburban sprawl that feels very heavily indebted to Walt Disney's original plans for Epcot.
We call it EPCOT, spelled E-P-C-O-T. Experimental, Prototype, Community of Tomorrow.
Hell, there's even a gigantic complex at the center of it. Unfortunately, Rocket is cast out by this faceless corporation because they think he's disgusting and imperfect and unworthy.
Look at you. How could you be part of a perfect species? You're simply a medley of mistakes we could learn from and apply to the creatures that truly mattered.
Much like Gunn was discarded by Disney after his tweets became a public firestorm.
You're an abomination! Nothing more than a step on my path! You freakish little monster! How dare you think you are more?
In his exile, Rocket is cared for by his friends and companions, much like Gunn has talked about being supported by his colleagues throughout his own departure from Disney.
And when that happened, I felt like everything in my life had been taken from me at one time. But in that moment, all of a sudden, all these people loved me in a moment when I thought my career was over. And I felt loved for the first time in my life.
Gunn's cancellation and his subsequent rehabilitation are a major influence on his work from that point forward. A large part of what Peacemaker is about is the question of whether somebody who has done terrible things can ever be truly redeemed and loved.
I've tried again and again to make up for my mistakes, but I'm not sure redemption is something that's truly possible. At least not here.
Even Superman features a plot thread in which its protagonist is harassed on social media in a way that profoundly affects and upsets him.
As you may know, or maybe you don't, since you claim not to read any of that stuff.
Very seldomly.
Maybe sometimes people catch you reading it and looking very upset. Hashtag super spy, hashtag super shit.
Super shit? Come on, Lois. You know that one specifically irritates me.
This is on the record, Clark.
Of course, Superman has always been treated as a messianic figure, particularly in film. But this savior isn't crucified on a cross. He's crucified on X. Incidentally, Gunn's work is also very clearly influenced by his time attending Jesuit school in St. Louis. His films are populated with religious imagery, and they often feature bad or absent creators who position themselves as would-be gods.
I'm what's called a celestial, sweetheart. A celestial like a god? Small G, son. At least on the days I'm feeling humble as Drac.
There is no God! That's why I stepped in!
Even Superman has its hero arrested by federal authorities at the direction of local powers that be, casting Flag as Pontius Pilate.
I'm sorry about this.
With Superman consigned to the underworld. 2, on the day after his departure from the world of the living, liberate those souls detained without judgment in what can best be described as Minecraft Hades. I mean, come on, there is literally a ferryman and a river Styx, and what is that gigantic black hole but the most literal manifestation of the idea of the outer darkness? By the way, in case you're curious, this is actually what many Christians believe happened to Jesus between the death and the resurrection. It's not really part of common pop culture, but it's the kind of thing that you learn in Jesuit school and it really sticks with you. And then finally, on the third day, he returns. He is, in the most literal manner possible, risen. The central point of all this is that Gunn clearly draws from his own life, interests, and history in telling these stories, even adapting popular comic book superheroes. Now, some fans might complain that Gunn is overstepping bounds here, that in adapting this material to screen, Gunn's primary obligation is to be faithful to the source material. However, the best of that source material is similarly drawn from the personal lives, influences, and backgrounds of the artists who created it. For example, Gunn often cites Grant Morrison's totemic run on Batman as a major influence on what he wants to do with his version of the Caped Crusader.
The Brave and the Bold is the story of Batman and his actual son, Damian Wayne. This is based on Grant Morrison's great comic book run. Damian Wayne is my favorite Robin.
However, that run is also deeply personal to Morrison. They have talked very candidly about how the driving force for that run, the emotional engine that propels it, is a metaphorical restaging of the central trauma of their youth, the divorce of their parents. Gunn himself has expressed a fondness for the idea that populist art can still be highly personal to the people who make it.
And I like telling a personal story within a spectacle. I find it's incredibly effective. I think it's rare.
He's right. It is rare. This is where I feel obligated to recommend that if you haven't already seen it, you should all go and see one battle after another. This isn't paid product placement. It's just a great example of a truly personal film for director Paul Thomas Anderson that is also a really great crowd pleaser. Films like that are rare at that budget level. And it's even rarer for films produced by major studios within established intellectual properties and franchises to have the sort of personality that Gunn brings to his movies. That's a large part of what makes him so interesting as a filmmaker. Now, to be clear, Gunn may not agree with all of this interpretation. In fact, he's gone on record denying the idea that the social media subplot in Superman is in any way related to his own personal experiences.
There are some really interesting parallels that the Superman's journey in this film. He is brought down by internet trolls and is saved, arguably, by love and friendship. That's an interesting parallel to the journey you've been on.
Literally never thought of it.
Is that true?
Yeah.
Until this moment, that never occurred to you?
No.
What do you have to say?
What do I have to say?
Of course, it's entirely possible that Gunn may be lying and may not want to talk about this in interviews. Gunn is probably savvy enough to know that likening yourself to a character that is often compared to Jesus Christ may not make for the best optics. If nothing else, Gunn is a creator who knows firsthand the perils of putting too much of oneself on the internet. It's also entirely possible to take this in good faith, to believe that Gunn has not consciously made the connection himself. It took James Lipton to explain to Steven Spielberg how Close Encounters of the Third Kind was informed by Spielberg's parents' divorce.
Your father was a computer scientist. Your mother was a musician. When the spaceship lands, how do they communicate? They make music on their computers, and they are able to speak to each other.
You see, I'd love to say, I intended that, and I realized that with my mother and father, but not until this moment.
To any observer, it's clear that Gunn draws from his own life and his influences in the stories that he tells. And Gunn is an extremely online personality, even by the standards of modern Hollywood. He maintains his own profiles across multiple platforms and actively engages with fans, perhaps, by his own admission, too actively.
I do tune out most of social media, but every once in a while there'll be somebody who will say something. It's always the weirdest stuff. It's never what you expect. Some weird thing that I go, God, that guy, and then I go, I think I might be getting upset about something a 12-year-old in India is saying. You know what I mean? I'm like, let it go.
So, whether consciously or not, admittedly or not, it makes sense that this fascination with online culture and the way that the internet affects modern life is a major recurring preoccupation in Gunn's filmography, coming to a head in the second season of Peacemaker. Obviously, the internet is a big part of the world in which we live, and it's telling that we're seeing more and more media about the ways in which the online world warps and distorts reality. Entire films play out through screens in a genre known as screen life. There are timely tales of internet insanity colonizing the American West. Even movies that don't heavily feature phones feel informed by the way that the internet has altered the way that human beings relate to one another, such as Celine Song's Past Lives, or even Materialists, which feels like a commentary on how the internet has changed dating.
I would never swipe right on a woman like that.
The second season of Peacemaker builds out from Gunn's big summer blockbuster, Superman. In particular, both stories place a heavy emphasis on the idea of a pocket dimension, whether engineered by Lex Luthor or stolen by Augie Smith. In Superman, the pocket dimension is controlled by a billionaire. It is designed to look digital, all blocks and spheres rather than naturally occurring shapes. It allows instant communication and coordination across impossible distances. Food deliveries happen over it.
Oh, here. I brought you a donut from Doe's Holes. New shop in Park Ridge, of all places.
It's a place where you can go and lose literally days of your life, and from which there is seemingly no escape. In fact, there's a big black hole at the center of it. Not to put too fine a point on it, but as a writer who isn't even a fraction as prolific as Gunn, that really stuck with me. Also, and this is a small detail but it feels very telling, it is worth noting that everybody who goes into the pocket dimension doesn't use it to teleport from one place to another. The Boravian leader doesn't use the portal to travel to Metropolis, Luthor doesn't use the portal to travel to Boravia, and even Mr. Terrific, Lois Lane, and Superman don't use the portal to travel as far as, say, Luthor's headquarters. When people leave, they typically do so using the same portal, or port if you will, that they used to get in. Which, frankly, feels surprising coming from a guy who wrote not one, but 2 separate Scooby-Doo movies. So while the pocket dimension is a shared space for communication and transference of data, it is not a physical bridge between 2 distant locations. Also, it is populated by armies of angry monkeys screaming nonsense. And, at the film's climax, this pocket dimension threatens to literally tear America apart, creating a chasm that becomes impossible for any person to cross.
I know writers who use subtext, and they're all cowards.
And look, I'm gonna be honest, I wasn't usually fond of this metaphor in Superman. It felt kind of facile. It's very convenient to believe that everybody yelling silly nonsense online is just a bot or a monkey. It avoids the hard work of actually engaging with what the internet has done to discourse and to many of the people who use it. It's easy to pretend that all those people yelling terrible things are just code. It's harder to accept that some of these are one's friends and neighbors and relatives who have fallen into that vast chasm. It's very telling that the gif of those screaming monkeys from that sequence has become a go-to online shorthand for the dumbest people you know, illustrating that you don't have to be a monkey created by Lex Luthor to yell stupid things on the internet. This is why the second season of Peacemaker works as well as it does. It takes this idea and develops it. It builds on the metaphor of this pocket universe as the internet. After all, these days, when everybody has a smartphone, what is the internet but an entire universe that you keep in your pocket? Gunn has talked about various literary influences on the second season of Peacemaker.
Think I'd be this buff if I looked at books.
The most obvious one, for reasons that we'll get to in a minute, is The Man in the High Castle. However, he's also cited Philip Roth's The Counterlife.
It's more like Philip Roth's The Counterlife than it is like Deadpool.
I guess what Gunn is saying here is that for our hero Christopher Smith, this is less Crisis on Infinite Earths than it is Crisis Between Two Earths. Hardcore comic pun for the win. But more seriously, The Counterlife is a very interesting source for Gunn to draw from. This is a novel in which the protagonist's reality seems to shift from one part of the book to the next, as history and memory are rewritten and recast. Gunn very cleverly uses the language of comic book storytelling to develop that idea within the show. Caught in the transition between 2 different versions of a cinematic DC universe, there's a clear sense of discontinuity to the second season of Peacemaker. In the previously segment, scenes from the first season are replayed with different actors and characters. Indeed, there is some question about how these characters literally fit in this new restructured world. Reality is broken, both personally in the way that these characters experience it, and more broadly in how the show fits with the larger canon. At the start of the show's second season, none of the regular cast are living the lives that they would want.
You're living in the worst level of Grand Theft Auto.
I have only been trained to do one thing my entire life, Doc. So you tell me, what the fuck am I supposed to do now?
Now, Peacemaker makes it clear that this pocket universe is the same basic concept as appeared in Superman, to the point that Rick Flag consults with Lex Luthor about the problem.
Well, for one thing, I don't need another rift tearing apart half the city.
That hurts.
And the show uses the same internet-sounding technical jargon about secure connections and pings.
I have a ping. I was always at a wobble, an unstable connection. But this one, it seems secure.
However, there is something fundamentally different in how Peacemaker approaches this idea of a pocket universe. In Peacemaker, the pocket dimension is treated like something from a fairy tale. It's revealed that Augie Smith procured his from something like a fairy or a goblin. Also, most of the gateways to these pocket universes are cupboards or wardrobes, evoking Narnia. Early in the second season, Christopher Smith crosses over into an alternate world, one that seems to grant his every desire.
Best dimension ever.
He is wealthy, famous, and respected. His father and brother are still alive, and they love him. The love of his life, Amelia Harcourt, loves him back. She is, incidentally, much more of a trad wife than her main universe counterpart.
You know, it's wild. I've never seen you wear black before.
No?
No. Or pants. It's Amelia, too. She's not herself either. She was wearing pants. Dad? Pants.
This is the internet. It's an illusory world of filters, AI-generated paradise, and endless idealized reels. It is a carefully curated aspirational version of the life that Chris wants to live. It's a world where Chris is the main character, and where he can escape the mundane disappointment of the real life that's failed to live up to his hopes for it. It is, to a certain extent, Plato's cave. Tellingly, Chris doesn't really treat the people in this alternate world as human beings with agency or autonomy. He lies to them constantly, deals with them under false premises. He's so preoccupied with his own idealized life that he doesn't bother to reach out to some of his best friends. If he did, he'd realize very quickly that things are not what they appear. The characters populating this world exist to reflect Chris's wants and desires back at him. He doesn't owe these people anything, because they're not actually real to him. His actions have no consequences, because this isn't the real world to him. It's enticing and seductive. The alternate world lures Chris in. He eventually goes to live in it full time, abandoning his real-life friends for people who are effectively strangers offering him validation. Despite coming from a town called Evergreen, Chris clearly believes that the grass is greener on the other side. This pocket universe seems so great that even usually savvy audience members were won over by it.
I hadn't seen him in anything since the late X-Files, and then all of a sudden he's just Peacemaker's dad.
The most
he's less racist this season. Not this season, seemingly, after one episode, less racist. Oh no, is he going to be racist? Oh no, he's going to be racist.
That's probably... I kind of feel a little bit like, you going, he's less racist.
I don't get it. What's bad about that?
Unfortunately, there turned out to be a twist. Turns out that this pocket universe was not so secretly a Nazi universe.
Oh, fuck me.
Central to the twist is the fact that Gunn did nothing to conceal it. Eagle-eyed, or eagly-eyed, viewers notice small hints from earlier episodes.
Why do all my clothes look like the Kardashians' furniture, huh?
Who are the Kardashians?
Seriously?
Harcourt makes the connection almost immediately after crossing over.
I haven't seen a single person of color ever since I've been here.
No way.
The point isn't that the universe was concealing its white supremacist undertones.
Oh, fuck, how'd I miss that?
It's that Chris was so desperate for the love and validation that it offered that he never questioned the ideology underpinning it. This feels like a none too subtle commentary on the way that internet radicalization works. Much has been written about the pipeline that lures young men into extreme political ideologies. It's often couched in the language of validation or self-actualization, teaching these often young white men to be the best possible versions of themselves. Get the girl of your dreams. Have the family that you deserve. Become the hero that you were meant to be. By the time they realize that they've been funneled into racist or misogynist ideologies, they're already deeply embedded in the community and its philosophy. By the time Chris realizes that this alternate Earth is a Nazi world, he's already abandoned all of his friends to live in it. The second season of Peacemaker is fundamentally the story of a guy who rejects the complicated and difficult real world, which offers a challenging path to redemption, but real meaningful connections with real people, in favor of an imaginary world where he can do whatever he wants without having to think or care about others. And to be clear, even within the second season, it isn't only Chris who is doing this. Several of the other characters have also created their own pocket universes and realities where they don't have to care about others in order to pursue their dream.
People gotta follow their dreams, Key. Even you said that. Yeah, not when their dreams are leeching off of somebody else's reality.
This second season is a story about the world that the internet has created, where everybody exists in their own isolated little bubble, living their own personal counterlife, being algorithmically fed content that can lead them to terrifying places if they don't stop to think about it, or if their friends don't intervene before it's too late. These young men live entire lives inside universes, often from the comfort of their own bedroom. It's also worth acknowledging that Gunn's work is particularly animated by fears around fascism and authoritarianism, particularly as they relate to the American superhero fantasy. His work is also fascinated by the contradictions of contemporary masculinity, and how that can lead to some very dark places. It's no surprise that the second season of Peacemaker should entangle these themes of fascism, masculinity in crisis, and the imaginary worlds of the internet into something that feels close to a thesis statement for Gunn's work in the genre. His work on Creature Commandos, for example, interrogates one of the most unsettling implications of the genre. If the audience is asked to believe in superhumans, does that imply the existence of subhumans?
Congress said we can't use human prisoners. These assholes aren't human.
And if we accept these separations of classes of people, which are often rooted on genetics, Does that lead us to think of some individuals as inherently superior, and others as inherently inferior? It's a deeply uncomfortable question, but it's one woven into the fabric of the genre. Understandably, very few adaptations approach this idea directly. However, Gunn engages with it consistently throughout his filmography. Gunn's superhero films typically feature at least one non-human character, often going on to develop the audience's sympathies for that character to get them to question what constitutes a person. Before we wrap up, and just to tie a nice bow on all this conversation, one of the most impressive things about Peacemaker is the way that it is in conversation with comic book legend Alan Moore. Obviously, Moore is one of the most famous and influential comic book writers ever, and his work has been adapted repeatedly and consistently. Not always well, though, and rarely with sincere engagement with Moore's larger themes and ideas. Now, Moore can be a controversial figure in some quarters of comic book fandom, and he has very clearly moved on from superheroes as a genre. However, during the 1980s, Moore came to prominence as one of the first writers to treat superheroes as a literary genre. Watchmen, his collaboration with artist Dave Gibbons, for example, was the only comic book to be featured on Times Magazine's top 100 books of the past century. Even if Moore himself has moved on, he remains a towering figure within the genre. The aesthetics of Gunn's DC are fairly squarely rooted in the late 80s. You can see that in the influence of John Ostrander on the Suicide Squad, and his use of characters like Guy Gardner and Maxwell Lord in Superman. It's clear that he's actually read and thought about this stuff, and is engaging with it thoughtfully and meaningfully in ways that go beyond mere fan service. Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons' Watchmen, one of the most influential comic books ever published, is a major touchstone for Gunn's work. You can see this in superficial ways. Mr. Terrific's ship in Superman looks a lot like Owlman's craft from Watchmen. Early in the second season, Vigilante becomes obsessed with owl facts, recalling the owl-related back matter from Moore and Gibbons' Watchmen.
It's an owl.
Okay.
Northern Saw-Whet. Dude, I know a shitload about owls.
At one point in Superman, the Justice Gang fight what looks like a giant purple squid visible in the distance, recalling the creature dumped on New York at the climax of that story. Hell, Gunn's take on Starro the Conqueror in the Suicide Squad as a city-destroying giant aquatic alien lifeform feels similarly indebted to the end of Watchmen. That said, going past these trappings and references, the biggest influence of Moore on Gunn's work is felt in Peacemaker. Before Gunn made the Suicide Squad, Peacemaker's biggest claim to fame was serving as the inspiration for the character of the comedian in Watchmen. Well, that, and that one Grant Morrison and Frank Whiteley comic that was kind of skewing Watchmen. This gets at the sense in which Peacemaker has been heavily influenced by the character that was created as a pastiche of him. Moore and Gibbons' comedian is a superhero turned right-wing government operative, and that is a very clear influence on Gunn's take on Christopher Smith.
It's a joke. It's all a joke.
Peacemaker. What a joke.
The first season of Peacemaker builds to an obvious riff on the climax of Watchmen, although it hinges on the teleportation of a giant space cow rather than a giant space squid. The alien butterflies offer Chris the chance of a sort of benign liberal tyranny. They offer to save mankind from itself by removing free will.
We made a vow to make the choices for you that you were incapable of making on your own, to save your people and your world no matter how many lives it cost us.
This recalls the plan that Ozymandias hatches at the end of Watchmen.
Humanity's savage nature will inevitably lead to global annihilation. So in order to save this planet, I had to trick it.
Killing millions.
To save billions.
And while Watchmen ends with the death of the right-wing hero to potentially save mankind, Gunn offers a sharp reversal, with the right-wing hero triumphing and making the choice to potentially doom mankind in the process.
Did I just kill the world?
Both are complicated, fraught endings that are in conversation with both each other and the larger superhero genre as a whole.
Why did you choose not to help them? Because of your proto-fascist libertarian idea of freedom?
What does it mean to invest these sorts of characters with this sort of power? More fundamentally, though, in exploring the connection between the superhero genre, fascism, white supremacy, and masculinity, Peacemaker deals very directly with the genre's relationship to the history of mass vigilantism in the United States, something that Moore addresses in the back matter of Watchmen, and has frequently talked about in interviews.
all you need to know about capes and masks in American superhero comics can be learned by a close viewing of D.W. Griffith's Birth of a Nation. We don't have a tradition of masked heroes really anywhere else in the world apart from America.
It's very strange to see part of a larger shared superhero universe actually grappling with that idea within the text of the work itself. In the second season, the alternate version of Augie Smith, who is not explicitly a Nazi,
Awfully generous for a Nazi.
Don't call me that.
Is a superhero on a Nazi Earth. He argues that he is doing the best that he can.
I fight the madman murderers and monsters in front of me because that's all I can control.
The sequence builds to a pretty bleak but very funny punchline, as Augie states that he hopes doing the absolute bare minimum and not participating in horrible atrocities will be enough to grant him salvation.
And at the end of my life, when I stand in judgment before God, I hope that he knows that I did the best that I could, and I left this world a better place.
We get a sense of what the show thinks about that. Gunn is asking the audience a pretty provocative question. Is a superhero who fights to maintain a fundamentally broken status quo still a hero in any tangible sense? These are all tough questions, baked into the superhero genre. What does it mean to actually talk about superhumans? How does that relate to the history of mass vigilantism in the United States? The question of what it means for a superhero to be either a liberal or a libertarian power fantasy. And what good is a hero who maintains a corrupt and broken status quo? Gunn tackles all of these questions while also telling a story that is tied into ideas of modern masculinity, encroaching fascism, and the way in which people have curated their own private pocket universes, how that is damaging society, and, ultimately, hurting ourselves. There's a lot of genuinely big ideas here. Gunn is clearly a guy who has thought a lot about superheroes, and what they mean in this specific cultural moment. And his willingness to grapple with these big ideas is part of what makes Gunn one of the most interesting writers and directors working in superhero film and television right now. Although the second season of Peacemaker never discusses these ideas specifically in the context of the internet, it's a large part of what the show is about, building on a metaphor that Gunn seeded in Superman. It's a really clever and thoughtful approach, using the conventions of superhero stories like alternate worlds and parallel dimensions to create a narrative that speaks perfectly to this moment. It's also aligned with themes that clearly interest Gunn as a filmmaker. This is a version of this story that probably couldn't have come from anybody else. In this case, Gunn don't miss. I've been Darren Mooney, and this was The Backdrop. Hey, so that turned out to be a little bit longer than I thought it was going to be going into it, but I hope it was a fun and insightful look at Gunn as a filmmaker, Peacemaker in particular, and the larger context of his filmography as it relates to superhero films. I think it is worth acknowledging, when I first saw Superman, I was not a huge fan of it. I didn't like it very much. That was seemingly a controversial opinion among certain people on the internet. I will say, having watched it multiple times now, I still really don't like it. Revisiting it for this, I found myself liking it even less than I did the previous time I'd watched it. Still, I like to think I was more than fair to the film itself in the context of this piece, and I think I was fair to Gunn as a filmmaker. You can't always be super, man.